Continuing in our study of Revelation chapter 1. Today we're going to be focusing on Jesus' phrase in verse 18 where he said, "I hold the keys of death and Hades." In our previous study, we began our analysis of verses 17 and 18, and when we finished that one, we had gotten all the way up to the last part of verse 18. I'm going to go ahead and just read verse 17 and 18 just to get a feel of where we were last time and pick up from where we're going to go today. So John says, "When I saw him, I fell at his feet like a dead man. He laid his right hand on me and said, 'Don't be afraid. I am the first and the last and the living one. I died, but look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades.'" The ancients viewed heaven and the underworld as being linked to our world by doors or gates. You can see this in Jonah chapter 2 as well as other Old Testament passages. So the picture of Christ possessing the keys of death and Hades could be another polemic aimed at the gods who are worshipped as rulers of the underworld. Now, we've noticed as we've gone through chapter 1 how often John is issuing a polemic against the gods. We saw it early in chapter 1 in, I believe it was verse 4, and we've seen it a few times since then, and we might be seeing the same thing right here. Now, the Greeks often thought that the keys of Hades, specifically of Hades, were in the possession of Hecate, who was a Chthonian or underworld goddess. Now, Hecate was also given certain titles by the Greeks that belong exclusively to God and Christ. For example, there's a Greek writing that says to Hecate, it says, "Beginning and end are you, and you alone rule all. For all things are from you, and in you do all things, Eternal One, come to their end." And that's obviously incorrect. But you can see how much similarities there are in that statement to various aspects of Revelation chapter 1. Which is further evidence of the polemical nature of Revelation as a whole, and chapter 1 specifically, and even right here in verse 18, even more specifically. Because what have we seen here in verses 17 and 18? Jesus says, "I am the first and the last and the living one." What did the Greeks say about their underworld goddess? Beginning and end, from you, for all things are from you, and in you do all things come to their end. So that's another way of saying first and last. Or Revelation also in other places does say beginning and end. "I am the first and the last, the beginning and the end." So when the Greeks are saying that to Hecate, John is coming along and making it clear, nope, that's not Hecate. That the one who has the power over death, over Hades, who holds the keys, who is the true first and last, who is the true eternal one, is Christ. And whatever power or authority these gods may have had has been stripped. That's the Christus Victor idea. I did a teaching on Christus Victor where I went through Colossians chapter 2. And that's the idea that at the cross and resurrection, Christ stripped these principalities and powers and rulers of their authority and exposed them and triumphed over them. So it's been my view that death and Hades are entities here. Now, I had assumed that I was going to be in the minority when I went to read the scholars, but surprisingly, that's not the case. Many of the scholars actually hold that view. Some of them nuance it, some of them present it as one of two main options, but there are some who hold that view outright. So that I was surprised by that, and it's very interesting, and we are going to be going through quite a few of their views here, or how they articulate it. So first up is Fanning. He says, quote, "Actually, death and Hades can both be viewed in the New Testament as 1. Places containing the dead, or 2. Personifications of mortality, or supernatural beings who rule over mortal or dead humans," end quote. And death was definitely viewed as a deity in the Canaanite religion. There's no doubt about that. The Canaanite god of death was named Mot. And death is often portrayed in this way in the Old Testament as an entity. For example, Hosea 13:14, God speaking says, I shall ransom them from the power of Sheol. I shall redeem them from death. O death, where are your plagues? O Sheol, where is your sting? Compassion is hidden from my eyes. So here, if you notice death, it says, O death, where are your plagues? The Hebrew word translated plagues is another lower class entity in the Hebrew language. And we notice also that Sheol, which is the Hebrew equivalent of Hades, is also personified in Hosea 13:14. And Hades was definitely a deity to the Greeks. I also found it very interesting to notice that Fanning cited Romans 5:12 through 14 in support of the option that death and Hades were supernatural beings. So when he said that they could be supernatural beings who rule over mortal or dead humans, he cites in support Romans 5:12, Romans 5:14, Revelation 6:8, and Revelation 20:14. So I thought it was fascinating that Romans 5:12 and 14 was the only other place outside of Revelation that he cites, because I have thought that death as an entity might be what Paul has in view in Romans 5. And so Fanning here, this gives support to that view, because he's linking the entities here, death and Hades as entities here, and linking that back with Romans 5. So I myself was wanting to do that, and so now I see Fanning doing that, and I think that is very interesting. Fanning continues, he says, quote, correspondingly, the phrases of death and of Hades can be either, one, objective genitives, keys that open or lock these places, i.e. keys to them, or two, possessive genitives, keys belonging to these supernatural beings, which they use to control humans. The former sense seems better here, end quote. So he prefers the objective genitive, or the idea that the keys that Jesus is talking about are keys that open death and open Hades. Now, I'm not with him on that one. I'm not so sure about him saying that that's the better interpretive option. But he does hold to that, and he's not alone. Some do hold to that view. But the two, death and Hades, seem to be supernatural beings when mentioned together in chapter 6, as well as chapter 20. And as we saw in Hosea 13, there are definitely supernatural beings there. And also Isaiah 28 mentions a covenant with death and an agreement with Sheol, or in the Greek Hades, which would be the same two entities being paired there and seemingly being capable of making a covenant. And we'll look more at that passage when we get to Revelation chapter 6. But Fanning continues, he says, quote, the point in this verse is that by his redeeming death and resurrection, Jesus gained authority over humanity's last enemy, death, end quote. And Paul follows this same line of thinking. 1 Corinthians 15:26, Paul says the last enemy to be destroyed is death. And Revelation 20 verse 14 says, then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. So that was Fanning's view. I thought it was really good, really interesting. I was even more surprised when I read a scholar named Jürgen Roloff. I think it's Roloff. He says, quote, the Greek word Hades can also refer to the realm of the underworld, the kingdom of the dead, Hebrew Sheol. In Revelation, however, what is intended throughout is not a place, but a demonic power. It governs the world of the dead, and, as is evident in the Greek depictions of the god Hades, possesses the key as an attribute of its strength. But now Christ has overcome death and Hades, that demonic pair. He has seized from them the key to that place where they guarded the dead. His followers participate in this victory and need not fear death anymore, end quote. So in addition to the Greeks viewing Hades as a god, the Greeks also view death as an underworld demon or monster, which would require it to be an entity. So that's even further support here, I think, of what we're talking about as these two being entities, because the Greeks viewed them both as such, and the Hebrews also viewed them both as such, as evidence from Hosea 13:14. A scholar named Mitchell Reddish, he says, quote, here and elsewhere in Revelation, death and Hades personified the forces of evil that are arrayed against God and God's people. They are no match, however, for Christ, who not only can release those who are captive to them, but also ultimately defeats and destroys them, end quote. So I don't really agree with Reddish when he said that death and Hades personify the forces of evil. I think they're actually entities themselves. But the second part of Reddish's statement, I absolutely agree with. They are no match for Christ. Now, in favor of the objective view, which is the one that Fanning favored, David Aune makes a good point in favor of that view. And he points out that the keys are to death and Hades rather than belonging to them. He also says that death as a being is never said to have or possess keys in any ancient texts, but that's only as far as we know, and that doesn't prevent John from making the claim that these entities held the keys anyway. So just because we've not yet found a Greek text that says specifically that death owned keys, that's not a death blow to the view that these are entities. Thomas Schreiner also views death and Hades here as personal powers or entities. And Justin Bass has written a lot on the keys here. He even has a book about it. And he says, quote, "The author of Revelation is the only writer of the New Testament who continues to portray death and Hades as a duo of terror against mankind, as has been shown to be somewhat normative in the Old Testament and the Second Temple literature," end quote. So yeah, he is linking it back to the Old Testament and saying that John is portraying death and Hades similarly to how the Old Testament portrayed the duo. Which again makes sense, as John was a Old Testament, a scholar in the Old Testament. He was very familiar with the Old Testament. So for him to be using Old Testament thought processes in Revelation is the norm, as we've noted in many studies prior. And as I mentioned in our last study, the Palestinian Targum of Deuteronomy 28 verse 11 and 12 asserts that God alone holds the key of life and of the tombs. So that John here is portraying Jesus as the one holding the keys of death and Hades is yet another ascription of deity to the Lord Jesus Christ. And Michael Heiser notes that John is, quote, "going to make sure the theology of the deity of Jesus doesn't get lost. And even then, he's going to show it's consistent with Jewish two powers in heaven thinking. This, the risen Christ, is the second power, not some angel, whether it's a biblical angel or Second Temple Jewish literature angel. It's not these. It's none of these. It's him. It is the risen Christ who is the second power. And now he's the holder of the keys because of the resurrection. All of this is happening in the book of Revelation," end quote. And on the significance of this ancient understanding in our own understanding of Revelation, Heiser says, quote, "This suggests both the risen Christ and the sequence that's implied, that before Jesus rose from the dead, he didn't have the keys to death and Hades. Somebody else did." And what these sources, especially Bass, are going to argue is that Jesus descended into the underworld at death. He was there 3 days, during which time he did certain things, one of which being that he conquered death and Hades, personified as supernatural enemies, and he took the keys from their domain, rising from the dead. Now, after he rises, he is now Lord of the living and the dead. He holds the power of life and death, something Revelation will make quite clear in judgment scenes later that involve the second death. So consequently, what Revelation 1:18 is describing is Christ's descent into the underworld, his combat with and victory over death and Hades. This would have been crystal clear to ancient literature readers, end quote. This also links, I believe, to Matthew 16:19. And if we remember in a previous study, I mentioned that Ford, in her commentary, linked the keys in Revelation 1:18 back to Matthew 16:19 as well. So Matthew 16:19 is when Jesus says, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Now this is a spiritual warfare statement. The binding and loosing is spiritual warfare. It's the binding the powers of darkness and loosing the oppressed. If you track this through the New Testament, you track this through other places in the Gospels, you'll see this. And even later in Revelation, Satan will be bound and thrown into the abyss. So the keys of the kingdom of heaven, binding and loosing, and the keys of death and Hades, I believe, are linked. They're all spiritual warfare statements, and Jesus achieved the ultimate victory, the ultimate spiritual warfare victory at the cross and the resurrection, which goes again back to Colossians chapter 2 and the idea of Christus Victor. His victory over these entities, as Ford has said, shows that Christ has full power over the resurrection. He passed through death at a definite moment of history, but he lives forever. Hence, he has the keys of death and Sheol, death and Hades, and can accordingly guarantee the faithful a sharing in his resurrection. Amen. So with that, we're going to close out this study. Thank you all for listening. God bless. I'll talk to you all very soon.